In my last lecture, I was again talking about some of the reasons why decolonization would be so intricately intertwined with some of the nature of what was going on in the Cold War, the post-World War II era. And for the United States, it ended up becoming a really deadly situation. It culminated in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So Cuba, keep in mind, if you look on the map, Cuba is um, extremely close to Florida. People actually escape Cuba on inner tubes or small boats and make it to the shores of the United States. So it's very, very close. Small island. And it was once owned by the Spanish. Prior to that, indigenous peoples, of course. Um, but what ends up happening is that that dictator Batista in Cuba, he was unpopular. And Gloria Estefan, if you remember that musician, come on, baby, let's do that conga. Anyways, her father was like a police officer for Batista, and so in America, a lot of Cuban Americans fled that revolution and tell you how evil, the communist dictatorship is in Cuba. And I have Cuban friends who've expressed such things. I've also had Cuban friends who've expressed the other view. Ultimately, here's what happens. You have a small elite group of wealthy Cubans, ultimately, and a lot of rich Americans. And about, I'm going to put a guesstimation around 80% of investments in Cuba are going out into America. In other words, the island's making a lot of money with sugarcane, which helps also make rum and other things. It has its wealth. It has a hot spot in downtown Havana. But the majority of the people in Cuba are poor, right? Like we see kind of in Mexico to this day, same thing. Wealthy Mexicans live very well. But the majority of Mexicans are poor, and they're not going to even be able to become middle class, right? So it was very fatalistic. And a guy named Fidel Castro, who's a lawyer, not even a member of the Communist Party, his brother was, meets up eventually with an Argentinian doctor named Ernesto Guevara, who's going to get the nickname of Che. And some other characters are going to get on a boat. They're going to leave from Mexico, land on the island of Cuba, and they're going to start a revolution to overthrow the government. Long story short, it actually worked. And I think there's no way in hell, I can't believe that some adventuristic Latino yuppie guys who decided that they're pissed off at the way the government's going in Cuba, with no aid from the Soviet Union, by the way, could have possibly overthrown the entire government and created a revolution if the government that was ruling in Cuba wasn't slightly corrupted, delegitimized, and hated by a lot of people. And so whatever we think of Fidel Castro now and the Cuban Revolution, I think one has to just kind of think, how many of us can imagine that a handful of anybody could get on a boat and go sail to Cuba right now and overthrow Fidel Castro's government? It's a crazy story, but it's true. And so there's a revolution that happens, and the United States is horrified that Fidel comes to power and brings this group that was ambiguously leftist, possibly Marxist. So the U.S. fails. The CIA and the U.S. tries to overthrow the Cuban Revolution by getting exiled Cubans to go in. What happens? Bay of Pigs is a failure. And so this really humiliates Kennedy in the United States. Within a year, the Soviets, under Khrushchev, secretly install missiles in Cuba. Imagine nuclear warheads faced at the United States from an island that you could literally take an inner tube dangerously, but possibly, our small boat to. This is I can't think of something more horrifying. Now, the death at 9/11, that's horrifying, but the potential deaths of a nuclear strike from an island right next to us that could almost touch us, that's horrifying. So the Soviets then, and by the way, the Soviets didn't officially ally themselves with the Cuban Revolution until after the Bay of Pigs. I'm going to clarify that, okay? So the U.S. finds out, and this creates this major crisis. And for several days, there's an actual chance of a nuclear war between the United States and Russia. And this was always scary. When I was in high school, you have to understand something. Until the fall of the Soviet Union, and by the way, Russia still has their nuclear weapons, the United States and Russia were always talking mess to each other. And we all knew as kids, it was like we could all die someday from a nuclear holocaust. And it could be started by either one. It doesn't matter who's right or wrong, because when those bombs drop, we're all going to die. So it's all going to be Hiroshima and Nagasaki times the world. So, very scary. As a side note, often not talked about, the U.S. had missiles with nuclear capabilities in Turkey facing Russia. So if you look here, here's Turkey. This was all once, this is Russia, a part of the Soviet Union too. Here's Turkey and here's Russia. One thing that's also not talked about in the Cuban Missile Crisis discussions, if you're familiar with it, the Soviet negotiation eventually was with the United States, is that the United States had to remove their nuclear missiles here from Russia, and they would remove theirs from Cuba. So Russia's not sounding so crazy when you think about the fact that we're at the doorstep of Russia with nuclear weapons. And so, again, I hate to always break our little fantasies about how the world works, but I mean, this is my country, and I, favor the United States, but it's ridiculous to assume that if we're going to play that game, right? If you're going to play hardcore nuclear strikes right here, then if Russia can do it the other way, they're going to do it too. So this was something though that's still not really discussed much about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, so this is the kind of things that could happen over the fact of bigger countries trying to dominate other smaller countries as well. And fortunately, that one was able. Cuba did remove the nuclear weapons, but forced by the USSR, and the U.S. made that worked that out with Russia over here. And so here's what was really the logic behind the Cold War and what just happened. Mad enough to be safe? That's a question. So, 1963, the nuclear test ban treaty was between the U.S. and the USSR. There was where the United States and the USSR really understood that they really couldn't mess with each other without the other one paying. Okay, and we still kind of have that understanding to this day. So the arms race did intensify. By 1970, there was thousands of nuclear weapons on both sides. And both sides could destroy each other. And so the United States and Russia had what's called mutually assured destruction. The U.S. could say, well, if you ever attack us, we'll obliterate your entire country. And Russia says, by the way, if you do the same, we have the same capabilities. And so what happened is, because the United States and Russia couldn't attack each other directly, and they had NATO and Warsaw Pact, that Russia and the United States got involved in proxy wars, which often were third world countries that the Soviets could influence, or the U.S. could, and that the CIA and the KGB could heavily infiltrate the so-called third world, and the battles would really take place there. So think about that in context of some of the things that I've shown you. The paper that you're going to be writing about, I'm hoping that you're kind of seeing from the chapter that we just read, and the lectures and the videos, kind of what I'm getting at. Any questions, please give me a call tomorrow.